Hi there. In this video, we're going to continue looking at user functions inside of Power Query. And in this particular video, we're going to look at function queries. Okay? Function queries are, well, they're queries that are functions, and they're functions that are queries. So up until this point, we've been defining all of our functions inside of a query, but sometimes that's not going to work for you. Sometimes you're going to run into a problem. Like here, for example, to start off with, we're in user functions, function queries concept.xlsx. We're in the query sheet. And we've got some source data over here, right? Here's where the data came from, and we haven't really done all that much to it yet. But here we've got these two queries. They should look pretty similar to you. We've got our store sales for all of our stores, and we've got our store members, or like club members for all of our stores. And for the sales, in this query, we've defined a growth rate function, and we've used it right here. And now we said, okay, great. We've already defined this function. Let's go look at it. I'm going to head up to Power Query, show pane if you don't already see the queries pane, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to come up here to edit. All right, so when we designed this query, come over here, we started by defining this function growth rate, right? And this should look pretty familiar. It takes this year's number, last year's number, and then it does this if then thing to make sure that last year's wasn't 0. And if last year's number wasn't 0, it takes this year, it subtracts last year, and divides the whole thing by last year's number, right? Well, that's fantastic. And here on this custom column, we have clicked on it. We called that function and put in our sales from this year and our sales from last year to get the correct growth rate. That looks fantastic. Okay, so let's. I'm going to show you two ways of doing it. I'm going to show you the slow way that's easy to remember. I'm going to close this guy. First, I could right click and come up here and go to edit, and that'll work just fine. But if you haven't noticed, over here where it says queries, you could twirl this guy open and you could just switch between your queries right there. So this is store sales, where we have the function, and we're going to come over here to store members. We say, great, we've got this function called function growth rate. Let's go ahead and call it over here to do this particular table. So we're going to add a custom column, and we're going to call this member or club member growth rate, and this is function growth rate. Okay, so we're going to put in this year's number, comma, and last year's number, comma, and when we hit OK, we get an error. Let me make sure I got this right. So we get the name function growth rate was not recognized. First, let me make sure I spelled it right. Yep, function growth rate. So we've defined function growth rate over here. Why can't we call it over here? Well, that's because when we define this function, we define it within this query. So we can only use it within this query. All right, now a lot of times that's just fine, but other times you want to be able to call the function from other places. Or maybe, just maybe, you don't like the idea of defining your function here inside of the query. You'd rather do it in its own separate place. So we're going to create a new query, and the only thing that query is going to do is be the function, okay? So we're going to hit backspace right there. I'm going to go ahead and select all this stuff right here. I'm going to do Control X, delete, and hit done. I'm probably going to get an error just because right now this particular function was calling, this particular step was calling that function, so I have to undo it. Okay, there we go. So there is no function defined on either query anymore. If I come over here, same problem, calling a function that doesn't exist. I'm going to hit delete to get rid of those. Okay. Now, in the clipboard, we've got that function. Let's go ahead and put it somewhere. So we don't want to put it inside this query because then it's only accessible here and not here. We don't want to put it inside this query because it's accessible here and not here. So we want to create a new query that is the function. Okay, that's pretty easy to do. We're going to head over to File, or I'm sorry, not File. We're going to head to Home, head over to New Source, click on New Source, and we're going to go to Other Sources, and you can kind of barely see it. Down here at the bottom of the list is Blank Query. We're going to click on that. And we're going to change the name of this to FNC growth rate, right? This is going to be our growth rate function. This query is going to be the growth rate function. Okay, so we're going to head over to the advanced editor. And right now we've got this sort of boilerplate, this boilerplate guy. And we're going to just select it all and hit delete. And we're going to do Control V. Okay, so now we could do this a couple ways, but let's just do it the very simplest way. The very simplest way, if I hit delete, And all I do is I list, I don't have any steps. There's only a single step, right? We've got the arguments, and then we've got this little operator here, which sort of basically says, hey, this whole thing is going to be a function now. Everything over here is arguments, and everything over here is the algorithm. We now have our function defined as the entire query. So when we go ahead and click done, this is now a query, this is now a function, just like before. Okay, so now we have a function growth rate that we can call from other queries. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to head over to add column, add custom column. And this is going to be called, which one? We're in store sales. Sales growth rate. Okay, so we're going to call the function growth rate, which we can call because it's its own query right now. Okay, it's sort of like a sibling of these other queries. So we're going to take this year's number, then we're going to put in last year's number, and when we hit OK, we should get the growth rate. There we go. That's perfect. Okay, let's do it one more time. Okay, so we're going to head over here. Right now, we're going to add another custom column. We're going to call this the club member growth rate, and we're once again going to call the growth rate function. And what are we going to put in? We're going to put in the club members from this year's number, comma, and last year's number. Well, that would be the club members from last year. Okay, so I close that out and click OK. And there we go. And now we've got a function that we can call from any number of places. So not only is the M code for these individual functions a little bit cleaner because there's not that function defined up there, I can also call the function from any one of my other queries, which is a pretty nice property to have. By the way, as long as I'm here, I'm going to do one more thing just so you can see it. I head over to the advanced editor. Right now, this is just a single step, and maybe that's just fine. I'm going to comment this out in case I blow the whole thing up. I can come back to it. So let's define it as a series of steps. I'm sorry, I did that a little fast. So I'm going to copy this, Control-C, up here, give myself a little more space, and do Control-V to paste. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, let's see, this stuff is going to stay exactly the same. I've got two functions, right? And now, everything down here is going to be a let in. Okay, let's see, delete 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so now I'm going to define this as a series of steps. So for the first step, why don't we go ahead, make this simple. First step equals, I'm going to go ahead, give myself a little space there. I'm going to take this whole segment right here, Control-X to copy it, Control-V to paste it, add myself a comma. Okay, so the first step, take this year's number, subtract last year's number, and divide by last year's number. Okay, good. 1, 2, 3, 4. Second step, I'm going to check to see, Control-X to cut, and Control-V to paste. For the second step, I'm going to take last year's number, see if it's equal to 0. If it is equal to 0, then do null, then just return nothing. Otherwise, return, well, I want you to return all this stuff right here, but all that stuff right there is just contained in first step. So Control-C, Control-V to paste. Okay. So in the first step, we basically define what our base number would be, assuming that last year the store was open. Then in the second step, we check to make sure that it was indeed, if it wasn't open last year, if the number was 0, we just return null. And if it was open, the number wasn't 0, we go ahead and return this number right here. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and clean this up. Oops. Okay, and finally, 1, 2, 3, 4. After my in, I have to say, all right, now that I've defined my two steps, what do I return? So I'm finally going to return the second step. So whoever calls the function is going to perform all of these calculations, and then when it's all done, it's going to return the second step. Let's see, it's wanting a comma somewhere. I wonder where it wants that comma. Let's see, you don't want it there. Make sure I don't have this right. Token comma expected. Where do I want the error? Oh, I see. Oops. There we go. That makes more sense. Okay. Sorry about that if that was a little bit confusing. So for the second step, says, hey, it was last year's. In fact, I'm going to encase this in parentheses just so it's easier to read. It doesn't really affect the way it evaluates any, just easier to read. So if the argument last year is equal to 0, then no, otherwise use the value from the first step. Click OK, and I am done. If I come back here, I get the same result. And, you know, if it wasn't immediately obvious, if I come here and change this, I say, hey, I don't want to do null. If it was closed last year, if it wasn't open, we're going to do 0. I hit done. Now when I come over here, what was nulls are now zeros. Right? Okay, yeah, so that last part's going to come in handy in the next video when we use this to transform a bunch of workbooks in a folder. Okay, well, I do hope that was helpful, if a bit long-winded, but I think it was useful.